Good afternoon. Well, it has been quite a couple of weeks in the land of food policy. I guess the good news about the Supercommittee's apparent failure is that we seem to be in less danger, although I think not no danger, of a new secret farm bill being snuck into a deal and passed on Wednesday without public input. But we still have a great deal to contend with when we consider the recent actions of GIPSA. GIPSA is the Grain Inspection Packers and Stockyards Administration. The Packers and Stockyards Act, or I'm going to keep calling it PSA, is something that was written in 1921 and brought back to life when it was included in the Farm Bill in 2008. And the basic idea behind it is simply this: too few companies have too much control over too much of the market. The market we're talking about is meat. And I'm thrilled to welcome you here today to hear what the three, it looks like two, but there will soon be three members of this very distinguished panel have to say about it. My name is Ivy Ken. I'm a sociologist here at GW, convening the university seminar on food. Along with a multidisciplinary group of faculty from the university's Urban Food Task Force, I've organized programming for the seminar this fall to focus specifically on the issue of food policy implementation. Food policy is supposed to be the thing that's going to save us, right? We have too many fat kids. We have too many food-like substances lining our supermarket shelves. And we have multi-billion-dollar companies making decisions for us that really have nothing to do with our well-being or health, but that really only have to do with increasing their profits. Individuals and communities have a large part to play in addressing all of this, but what supports them, the foundation on which they can rely, is good food policy. And who's not in favor of good food policy, right? Sounds great. And I've mentioned before that as a sociologist, I'm always stunned when a good policy gets written and passed and funded, because sociologists are very good at identifying social problems, but we often pay little more than lip service to actually solving them. So good food policy seems like a dream come true to me, and I know what a challenge it is to even get a policy into place. But then I ask, what happens next? When the policy is in place and the law is on the books and the funding stream has been approved, what happens? Well, the darn thing has to be implemented. And the deeper I get into food policy, the more I understand how crucial this implementation stage is. This is where the thing lives or dies. And so this fall, our community here at GW is focused on food policy implementation. Last month, many of you were here as we discussed a food policy that's sort of public health and education related, the 2010 DC Healthy Schools Act. And as a follow-up to that event, I'd like to assure all of you, straight from the mouths of DC Councilmember Mary Che and DCPS Food Services Director Jeff Mills, that pizza is not a vegetable in DC schools. Maybe in Congress it is, I don't know. But today we're taking on a food policy related a bit more to issues of sustainability, the environment, economics. This is the mother of all food policies, the Farm Bill. We can't talk about the whole thing, of course. I don't know how many of you have ever tried to read the Farm Bill. It's a social phenomenon in itself. It includes everything from the legal difference between long and short grain rice to how powdered non-dairy milk should be measured. To say this thing is comprehensive is to say that jalapenos are mild and bland. So we can't talk about all of it, but we can home in on one fascinating bit of it. And today that part is the language of the Packers and Stockyards Act. So let me paint you a picture with very big, broad brushstrokes and allow my guests to fill in the details. Hi, welcome. When it was originally passed in 1921, the PSA was considered to be one of the strongest antitrust laws ever. But enforcement waned pretty quickly. It was written really when the industry was quite different. And one of the simple goals it was meant to achieve was to ensure that the practices of buyers and sellers in the livestock and later poultry markets were fair, reasonable, and transparent. But as you can imagine, if it's not enforced, then fair, reasonable, and transparent markets give way to special deals and collusive agreements and that bugbear capitalist self-interest. The act was amended a few times over the decades, but it was not until the U.S. Senate Committee on Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry, otherwise known as the Senate Ag Committee, sought to put some PSA language in the Farm Bill in 2008 that new life was really breathed into it. And this is sort of the startling moment of the story for me, because this thing had been on the books for almost 100 years, and as far as I can tell, for most of that time, it was widely ignored. And then somehow, the Senate Ag Committee was able to resurrect it in this really compelling way. One of our guests today, who just walked in, welcome, is Mr. Mark Halverson, who works with Senator Tom Harkin of Iowa and is the staff director and chief counsel for the Senate Ag Committee. He was in the room and behind the scenes and in the action when the committee took on the issue of unfair livestock and poultry markets, and I invited him here today to share a bit of that story with us. I asked him to address the "what happened" question. How were you able to accomplish this? So he is generously sharing his time with us today, and in a moment he will tell us a bit about that story. And as I mentioned in the opening, getting this bill written and passed is no small feat, but just as amazing is the fact of its implementation. And what I found as I've looked across a wide range of food-related policies is that this implementation process really has to be watched. It's hard. It's really difficult to get every individual and every institution on board, informed, and cooperating in some way so that the letter and the spirit of the policy actually become reality. And to make sure it's done right, somebody has to track it. Now, GIPSA, which I said is the USDA's Office of Grain Inspection, Packers and Stockyards Administration, has oversight responsibility. They are supposed to write the rules, define the terms, handle the complaints, and in general be in charge of the whole enforcement process. But there even has to be a watchdog over them to make sure they're doing that. Patrick Woodall on our far left and his staff at the organization at Food and Water Watch have served in just that capacity. As research director and senior policy advocate there, Mr. Woodall has done important, what I have to imagine is frustrating, exhilarating, and probably sometimes tedious work of keeping track of and analyzing issues like livestock market concentration and the policies meant to address it. Months ago, I asked Mr. Woodall to come here and describe for us how the implementation of PSA has gone. And at that time, he kept talking about these rules that had to be handed down from GIPSA. Little did we know that the rules would finally come just a week and a half ago, and that they would be so sorely disappointing. Mr. Woodall will tell us a bit about that, and then I've also asked him to speak to us as a researcher, as a policy analyst, to give us a glimpse into what a person or a team of scholars or advocates might focus on if they were interested in tracking the implementation of a food policy like this one. But first, to start us off this afternoon with a bit of context about market concentration in general, is Barry C. Lynn, Senior Fellow at the New America Foundation. Mr. Lynn also directs the Markets, Enterprise, and Resiliency Initiative at the New America Foundation, and his new book deals specifically with the sorts of monopoly and antitrust issues we're focused on today. The book is called Cornered: The New Monopoly Capitalism and the Economics of Destruction. So would you please join me in welcoming all our panelists as I now invite Mr. Barry Lynn to the podium.
Thank you, Ivy, and it's great to be here today. And the one thing that Ivy said in the introduction about sociologists, I just, was a bit perhaps overly humble. I mean, that sociologists are sometimes good at identifying good solutions, but not necessarily in implementing them. You know, frankly, if we didn't have sociologists in this country, we'd be in a lot worse shape than we are now. There's a friend of mine, someone I've worked with very closely. His name is Chick Perot, and he wrote a book called Normal Accidents some years back. And he's a sociologist, but he actually, when it comes to running complex systems, his book is the most important document for actually sort of setting a set of principles for running complex systems safely, like systems like nuclear power plants. Sociologist. Anyway, today's, the main subject today is, the GIPSA, Packers and Stockyards. And, but to provide a sort of a bigger frame, what I really want to, note, sort of change the language a little bit and sort of point out that when, Packers and Stockyards was first passed, I mean, it was an anti-monopoly measure. It was an anti-trading company measure. And I want to sort of just say that before jumping back a couple hundred years to 1773 and looking at the sort of the original Tea Party. And, a lot of people nowadays like to say that the Tea Party was sort of an action against taxation. And it actually didn't really matter anymore whether you had representation or not in today's narrative. But in fact, the Tea Party, the original Tea Party, was an action against monopoly. It was an action against the British East India Company. It was an action by people who did not want their commerce here in this country, be it in tea or anything else, controlled by some distant company. And there's actually what are some proofs of that fact? One proof is the fact that it was primarily an anti-monopoly action rather than an anti-taxation action, is the fact that there was a rumor afoot in the days leading up to the months leading up to the actual Tea Party that the tax had been canceled. And yet, in Boston and in the other colonies, people continued to prepare for some kind of a protest. And there's actually another sort of more direct bit of proof, which is a letter that was written by a number of folks and signed by a number of folks in Boston, including Samuel Adams and John Hancock. And they said that this is the problem with the Tea Act, they wrote in this letter, was that it was, and this is a quote, introductive of monopolies which, besides the trains of evil that attend them in a commercial view, are forever dangerous to public liberty. So the reason that we, in terms of for me to put this into a frame is that, what I want to emphasize is the fact that anti-monopoly actions, going back to the beginning of the nation, they're not primarily economic in nature. They're not primarily, to ensure free commerce, but they're primarily and always have been political in nature. And it's like in this country for the first 200 years of this country, anti-monopoly law, going back to 1773, was the single most fundamental tool that we used to sort of protect ourselves against concentration of economic and hence political power. It was our single most fundamental tool that we used to extend the sort of concept of checks and balances into the political economy. It was our single most fundamental tool that we used to prevent the erection of private government over us. And that's what giant corporations are. They're forms of private government. And the only thing that's really sort of perhaps unfortunate about anti-monopoly law is sort of the name, which is that it's anti, because sort of at its heart is a very simple, positive vision, and the vision is of independent citizens living in an independent republic. And, it might be worth us taking a couple of moments today just sort of to recollect exactly what it meant to be an independent citizen for the founders. And the idea of an independent citizen was that you would have no master. that you would have no one who would be able to tell you what to do. Now, this is not merely an issue, however, of having an open ballot box. It was also, and this is actually really key, there was a matter of having open markets. That in any market relationship, in any political economic relationship, whenever you were bringing some idea, some good, some product to market, you would have not merely multiple sellers in that marketplace, but you'd have multiple buyers. It was a fundamental rule, a fundamental goal of the founders, that we would live in an open market system in which there would always be, whenever possible, multiple buyers as well as sellers. Buyers as well as sellers. So, with that sort of in mind, I just wanted to sort of jump ahead and not so much look at meat, but look at a couple of other of the sectors, political economic sectors in the United States today, and sort of get a sense of where we are as a nation. I'll start with beer. Because this is actually something that it's pretty simple. It involves little bottles. We can sort of understand how the shape of the market is. It's an area where if you sort of step back and you just sort of look very quickly at the marketplace, it seems like this is a case in which you've had a huge explosion in variety, a huge explosion in sort of an opening up of the marketplace. And the fact was that in 1978 there were 42 beer brewers in the United States, corporations that made beer. Today there are about 1,800 corporations, companies that brew beer. But there's something hidden inside that. And what's hidden inside those numbers is the fact that in 1978, there were the largest of the corporations in that sector was Anheuser-Busch, and they had less than 20% of the marketplace, 1978. Today, the two largest corporations, which is Anheuser-Busch InBev, which is now based in Belgium, and South African Breweries, which controls Miller Coors, these two companies, which openly collude maybe not in the borders of the United States, but they don't necessarily have to because they can talk to each other outside the borders. They're global companies. These two companies together control 90+% of the marketplace for beer in the United States. So I spent a lot of time last few years talking to folks who actually try to brew beer, bring beer to the marketplace. And one of the things that happens if you're one of these little companies, you live in fear. You are given they cede to the little companies, they cede to 1,795 of the companies, they get to share 5% of the marketplace. If they get a little bit bigger than that, they tend to get squashed down. How do these big companies squash them down? They don't let them ride their trucks. They don't let them onto their shelves. They don't let them onto their retailers that they control. So here you have, in the year 2011, you have a foreign trading company, Anheuser-Busch, running a marketplace here in the United States in which American citizens are trying to operate freely. You have American citizens in this country who do not have the liberty to work their own properties. They do not have the liberty to bring their own ideas into an open marketplace where they can operate independently and freely with each other, with one another, with their own neighbors, with their own community. Not possible. That marketplace belongs to a foreign trading company. They govern it for their own purposes. Same thing is true with eyeglasses. You go to the store, you go to the mall, you walk down the mall, and what you see, you might see a store that's called Pearl Vision. You might see another store called Lens Crafters. You don't like the prices you see in those stores. So you go to a different store. You go to Target Optical. It's a little cheaper. You go to Sears Optical. Maybe you got a little more money in your pocket. You go to Macy's Optical. Or you go to that boutique around the corner. Every one of these places you go, you're dealing with a single company. It's called Luxottica, an Italian company. They own those retailers. They also own most of the manufacturing. And through their control of manufacturing, they control all those independent boutiques. They tell them what to do. They tell them what to carry. It's true with advertising. In this case, it's like individual people went to fancy schools. They go to New York to get a job up on Madison Avenue. You guys have all seen that show, Mad Men, perhaps. In Mad Men, there's all these different agencies. Some are quite big, but there's all constantly changing. Like people leave one agency, go to another agency, and that's because you had back then 20 large agencies and a whole lot of small agencies. Lots of freedom to move around. Today, by contrast, three companies, three holding companies, Omnicom, Interpublic, and WPP, control that whole marketplace up there for the labor of all these Ivy League, educated folks who work on Madison Avenue. So here they are, the products of some of our fanciest schools. They want to go get a new job, can't. Want to go talk back to the boss. Want to get a higher pay for their work, can't do it or won't do it. They're afraid to do it. They live in fear. You speak up, you might get booted. It's true with Silicon Valley. That's there you see it, the bastion of liberty, we're told. This is the place that's coming forth, bringing forth the technologies that are going to melt down all control, all systems of control, of political and economic control. Well, fact is, DOJ didn't do a whole lot last year when it came to antitrust. They did do one thing. They brought a case against a company called Apple. And they actually got Apple to admit that they had conspired with 5 other companies, including Intel, including Google, 3 others, to not hire each other's workers. Now, these are companies that have bought up control over entire industries. Google we're at 100 plus. We're at 100 acquisitions and counting right now. They have purchased control over an entire marketplace, and yet, so too Apple, and yet, when it comes to the people who work for them, they don't really want them to enjoy any kind of marketplace whatsoever. Even with this kind of concentration, the fact, just the idea that someone would move from Apple to Google, that disturbed them. So they got together, the lords of Silicon Valley, and they said, hey, let's just make a rule just between us, just to stamp that out as much as possible. So here you got PhD scientists, PhD engineers, with their most basic political liberties restricted. That's America in the year 2011. Book industry in this country, same thing. I bet a lot of you buy your books on Amazon. Amazon controls, just so you understand, Amazon controls upwards of 50% of almost every single important line of books in this country, except for some of the more popular lines, where you got the big retailers will come in, like a Walmart. Political books, business books, Amazon, 50% plus. When it comes to ebooks, 70% plus. If you run a publishing company in this country today, and even if it's the biggest of these publishing companies, and I spent a lot of time talking to the CEOs of these publishing companies. You get them in the back room, what they will tell you about Amazon, it's scary. You bring them into the front room, you say, can I quote you on that? Can I put you on camera? Can I put you up on a platform? No way. You know what Amazon will do? They actually have done it. They proved exactly what they'll do if someone tries to buck them. They did this last year with Macmillan. Macmillan wanted to price its own books. Imagine that. That's how a marketplace works. Producer makes a price, consumer decides whether or not to accept that price. That's how markets work. They wanted to make their own pricing for their own ebooks. Amazon said, no, we got other plans, we got other agendas, we're fighting other people, we're fighting Walmart. We're going to do this, not you. Macmillan insisted, and so Amazon cut them off from the marketplace for 10 days. Cut them off. You could see their books up online. You could see, but the buy button was gone. You could not buy those books. They were immediately cut off from 50+% of the market of their marketplace. That's how the railroads, the people who controlled the railroads back in the last plutocratic era, that's how they got control. They leveraged control of the railroads. These companies like Amazon, those are the railroads of the 21st century, and we're sitting back and we watch these people running these trading companies leverage that power to concentrate absolute power over these industries. Walmart, getting back to meat. Some of you have probably seen, traced, the actual structure of power within the meat industry. You've got massively concentrated companies that have concentrated their power often using the power of Walmart as their excuse. Oh, we have to grow bigger because we have to have some pricing power to deal with Walmart. Walmart, if you are looking for the reincarnation of the British East India Company, there you got it. They control upwards of 50% of many lines of business in this country. 30% plus of most. And just to trace this out, they do not merely have the power to suppress production in this country, to determine who does what where in this country, which is the way the British East India Company actually operated in India, where they did have a monopoly. They never got it here, but they did have a monopoly in India, and they used their power to suppress production in order to shift it someplace else, which happened to be England. Well, look, if you trace back the lines of control over Walmart. Where do their supplies come from? It's not from the United States. It's not from Mexico. 70% plus from China. China can control, can cut off that supply tomorrow if they want to. But it's not merely the supply of goods that flow through Walmart. It's also Walmart has exposed itself by building nearly 400 large stores inside of China. About a month ago, Beijing shut down every one of those stores for 2 weeks. The same way that Amazon shut down Macmillan. So the boss for Walmart, it ain't in Bentonville. The boss in Walmart is someplace else. How do these people use their power? And I'm just going to bring it back because it's to meat, because I did have a few weeks back, actually it was over the summer, spent some time with some farmers out in West Virginia, people who grow chickens. And looking at how these are a bunch of farmers that sell into a single plant run by Pilgrim's Pride up in Moorfield, West Virginia. And these guys, one of the guys I talked to had actually spoken up in one of these hearings last year by the DOJ. And one of the things that happened, actually it will be hopefully illegal relatively soon, which is that one of the things that happened to him afterwards is, lo and behold, wasn't getting any more flocks. They just cut off his flocks. And that, of course, means they cut off his cash flow. But there's this thing, I don't know how much you guys have actually looked at this issue of tournaments, what a tournament is. It's a really fascinating thing that has been imposed. A lot of people are trying to impose tournament systems of competition in sector after sector after sector of this economy, but it's most advanced in chickens because chickens have been a vertically integrated system for longer than most other former marketplaces. And in this case, how does a tournament work? The idea behind the tournament is that those 300 families that sell into that one plant in Moorfield, West Virginia, those 300 families, the idea of a tournament is that they get to compete with each other. They compete with each other. And a marketplace, how does a marketplace work? Everyone brings their chickens to the marketplace. The buyers all, look at the supply. At the end of the day, you end up with a market price. That market price, per pound of chicken flesh, this is pretty much what everyone's going to walk out. If you got a slightly, defective chicken, maybe you're going to have a little bit less. But everyone gets pretty much the same thing. It's an egalitarian outcome. If you work harder, you get more. Well, that might work for the farmers, but people who run Moorfield, Pilgrim's Pride, what they want to do is they want to make it work better for them. So what they want to happen is they want those farmers to compete against each other. How do they compete against each other? They deliver them a flock of chicks. They deliver them some feed. And then they come back 35 days later, and then they take away the chickens. And theoretically, this is how it's supposed to work. They're going to look at which of these farmers transformed feed into pounds of chicken flesh most efficiently. And then those who did so most efficiently, they're going to give them a special bonus. And those who did so least efficiently, they're going to take it away. So the idea, though, it's like, okay, we step back, we're consumers, so we think, oh, well, this means that the chicken farmers will work harder for us. It'll become more efficient. We'll get cheaper chicken. So we say, oh, maybe that's that's an okay thing. Well, let's take it another step and actually look at the fact that there are no standards when it comes to the quality of the feed that are delivered to those chicken farmers. There are no standards when it comes to the quality of the the chicks that are delivered to those chicken farmers. And those chicken farmers are not allowed to see the grown chickens being weighed. All of the information is nonsense. All of the decision about who gets more is arbitrary. We have a system out there in which 300 families are having their lives determined by some foreman who has the ability to say, well, you're going to do well today, and you ain't, because you wouldn't kiss mine. So anyway, that's here we are, 235 years after the original Tea Party. And our present Tea Party is whether they're attacking the government. Hopefully, if we can tell this story more effectively, we can get today's Tea Party working along with Occupy, working along with normal American citizens, everyone else, to actually realize that the issue is not merely a matter of food. It's not merely economic. This is political, and it is the most fundamental political battle that we can be having. So the people who are fighting this fight in agriculture, the people who are fighting this fight in the stockyards, people who are fighting this fight who are growers of beef and growers of pigs and growers of chickens, these people are actually in the vanguard. And I am absolutely certain that we are going to succeed. But the first thing we have to do is see what is before our eyes. So anyway, thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Lynn. And now for a story about a group of political actors who do and did seem to recognize some of the problems that Mr. Lynn brought up. Mr. Mark Halverson.
Well, I appreciate this chance to be here and talk with you a little bit about some of the history of efforts to try to revive some aspects of the Packers and Stockyards Act in the last Farm Bill, really the last two Farm Bills. Senator Harkin from Iowa was the chair of the Senate Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry Committee. During both of those bills, we got a few provisions in the 2002 bill, if I remember right. It was to expand coverage of the Packers and Stockyards Act to swine contractors, that is, companies that contract with farmers to produce swine on contract, and then also an arbitration-related provision. The significant increase or the significant action to strengthen the Packers and Stockyards Act was in the 2008 bill. Senator Harkin was the chairman. Congressman Peterson from Minnesota was the chairman on the House side. So we did have two Democratic chairs. The administration was Republican. President Bush actually, he and the Secretary of Agriculture were not particular players in putting the bill together. He ended up vetoing the bill on two occasions. It had to go through twice because of some problems in enrolling the bill, whatever. So there were two processes in which President Bush vetoed the bill, then Congress overrode the veto. So basically, it was a matter of whether Congress would work to try to strengthen the Packers and Stockyards Act in some ways. For a number of years, the Packers and Stockyards Act, since 1921, has had application to the livestock, and as was mentioned more recently, live poultry dealers. The basic principles and the basic requirements that we're talking about here are sections 202A, which prohibits any unfair, unjustly discriminatory, or deceptive practice or device, or section 202B, which prohibits any undue or unreasonable preference or advantage or prejudice or disadvantage based on individuals or the locality or the location that the producers that are located. And so for a number of years that has been in place. There are other features as well. There are aspects of the Packers and Stockyards Act that prohibit apportioning supply, prohibit collusion between the packers and companies, that sort of thing. Those are more of an antitrust, anti-monopoly nature. The two provisions that I cited to you, though, having to do with unjust discrimination or unfair practices that deal with undue preferences or advantages or disadvantages, prejudices, those we believe and have argued, and the department and the administration under the president, under President Obama have argued that the Packers and Stockyards Act, in those provisions at least, is not limited just to dealing with anti-monopoly, with monopoly problems or with collusion or with anti-competitive practices, but it actually prohibits, as I say, the unfairness or prejudice or discrimination in dealings of the packer with even with just an individual producer or person who's contracting to grow hogs or contract to grow poultry or even selling sheep, hogs, cattle, and so forth. So we had, over the years, before in Congress, had heard from producers who had been poultry, livestock, and so forth, that had come in with complaints that the department was not effectively carrying out the Packers and Stockyards Act, not enforcing it. Part of the problem in that that they were not carrying it out to carry out the intent and the letter of the law as it was enacted back in 1921. If you look at some of it, and some of this is cited in the rulemaking that the Department of Agriculture did, the intent of the Packers and Stockyards Act was to go further than either the preceding Sherman or Clayton Acts or the Federal Trade Commission Act, and actually to deal with problems that were not really addressed in those preceding bills. And so it was meant to have a broad application. The Supreme Court said so in a challenge in 1922, I believe it was the case, where the Supreme Court basically affirmed Congress's power to legislate in this area and essentially affirmed the scope of the Packers and Stockyards Act. So the underlying principle there, which I would just mention, and that was the motivation for the act in the first place, and it's obvious from Mr. Lynn's previous comments and so forth, it is this huge disparity in market power between the companies that are involved at that time. Certainly, it's even more concentrated in many of these markets now from the standpoint of who the buyers are, who the contracting parties are, contractors with the individual farmer who's trying to grow pigs or chickens or cattle or whatever. So it's the disparity in market power, and that was well recognized in the earlier antitrust laws, but also particularly in the Packers and Stockyards Act. It's just to recognize that imbalance and then to try to have some remedies against the imbalance. So in the 2008 bill, we did work then to try to include some provisions that would push the Department of Agriculture to go ahead and issue some rules and regulations to try to give better content and effectiveness to the provisions that were already in the Packers and Stockyards Act. So one of the key, there were four basic ones having to do with the Packers and Stockyards Act itself, and then the Secretary also was to issue some regulations having to do with arbitration. On the Packers and Stockyards Act itself, the Department the Secretary was instructed to issue regulations that would establish criteria to say whether an undue or unreasonable preference or advantage has occurred in violation of the Act. What that basically gets at is whether one producer or one set of producers of cattle, hog, sheep, poultry growers, or whatever, whether an individual or set of people is treated unfairly or is treated subject to discrimination or prejudice versus others. And to an extent, that tournament system that was described earlier is an aspect of that. It can be even more blatant, particularly if someone tries, let's say, to organize perhaps to change the law or tries to organize to get the Packers and Stockyards administration to carry out the law more effectively, then those people can be seen as troublemakers. And they could be discriminated against when buyers make the rounds on buying cattle, hogs, and so forth. Other aspects of it would be whether there are undue premiums or undue discounts involved. I mean, it's an arrangement as to what the price relationship is on quantity or time of day delivery or whatever. So one of the things that this problems that this is meant to get at is, let's say that there are some larger producers of poultry or hogs, cattle, that can deliver much larger quantities to the packer, and that may have some economic advantages from the standpoint of efficiency for the packer or the processor. But what if a group of smaller individuals can pool their animals together and come up with the same quantity or whatever? Nonetheless, there are instances where the packers or processors would say they're not interested in paying the same price to this group of smaller producers who could get together offering the same deal to the packer or processor, same quantity, same efficiencies, and so forth. Other instances would be where there are at least complaints voiced that there are punitive measures taken on assigning premiums or discounts based on the quality of animals, whether a steer or a cattle meet their quality requirements or what. There's a lot of ability in the processes used by the packers to assign a value, a market value, and what they pay based on the lean meat yield or the quality, the marbling, what the grade, and so forth. And so that there's, again, this provision in the Farm Bill was meant to try to get more rulemaking out there to clarify better when the Packers and Stockyards Administration could take some enforcement action to prevent that sort of discrimination. The second one was requiring the Secretary to go ahead and issue regulations on whether a live poultry dealer has provided reasonable notice to poultry growers of any suspension of the delivery of birds under a poultry growing arrangement. Here again, the fact situations that were brought to our attention had to do with sometimes it's just the arbitrariness of the contract, the poultry integrator, the processor, also called the live poultry dealer, the ability of that person essentially to leave the question open whether this person who's growing out these chickens under contract is going to get a new set of chickens to fill their buildings. So they have an investment, capital, fairly large investment oftentimes in the facility. That's also their livelihood. So there can be uncertainty whether these birds are going to be delivered as expected to be grown out by this family, typically that's growing out the chickens. So basically this was to require the department to specify some requirements. What's the advance notice that needs to be given before birds there'd be a suspension. If I remember right, I think it was 90 days. There would have to be a 90-day advance notice to say that to this grower that the company is not going to deliver any more birds to fill this facility, and that 90 days advance notice would have to be given before that's done. Again, in some instances, it was not only just the arbitrariness of the decisions by the integrators, the poultry dealers, but also just a question whether, in instances, it was punitive. It was a punitive step. It was always, again, in that sort of a power arrangement. The question is, if you're reliant on a company, and the representative of that company, and to deal with them to get the poultry into your facility, again, you've got to pay off the loans on the facility. That's your livelihood and so forth. The person that's making the decision, letting you know whether you're going to get more birds, more chickens to fill your facilities, has a lot of power. And there were certainly complaints that power was being exercised for retaliation in some instances, or just punitively, arbitrarily, and so forth. The third requirement criteria for when a requirement of additional capital investments over the life of a poultry growing arrangement or swine production contract constitutes a violation of the Act. So that was to deal with a situation where there is an existing contract or arrangement for growing pigs or chickens under contract, and the company then says, well, actually, for you to continue with us, notwithstanding the fact you've already got a substantial investment in this facility, notwithstanding that, for you to continue with us, you are going to have to invest X dollars more, maybe $100,000, I don't know, whatever it might be, but usually it might very well be a very substantial sum of money. And if you don't do that, then we're not going to continue with you. We give you no more, the contract's going to be discontinued, you get no chickens, no more pigs to grow out, and that sort of thing. Again, and that's very similar to the preceding one, although more a different fact situation, but it's very similar insofar as that could be an arbitrary decision, an arbitrary requirement that's imposed even after the person's made the investment, and they feel as if they've made an investment that ought to be sufficient for a number of years, to be told a short time later then, or partway through the contract or the arrangement, that no, they've got to make more capital investments. And then the fourth area was to specify criteria if a live poultry dealer or swine contractor has provided a reasonable period of time for this grower or producer to remedy a breach of contract that could lead to termination of the poultry growing arrangement. Again, the concerns there were that reports of arbitrary cancellation of contract based on pretextual allegations of breach of the contract, or maybe maybe the company or the representative of the company might say, aha, you've broken the law in this way or another. There's no real adjudication, no determination whether the law has been broken, but somebody could just allege a violation of the law in some fashion, say your contract's terminated. Maybe, I think in some cases, we're going to come out and pick up these chickens or pigs, you get no payment under the contract or whatever. Or termination of the contract could lead, again, to an end of an arrangement, again, that the family's relying on for their income. They have a substantial investment in the facilities, and there certainly were reports, at least, of arbitrary cancellations, terminations of these contracts, citing specious breach of contract and that sort of thing. So, again, our point here in working on these provisions and these instructions was not necessarily to say that every complaint was valid, or not necessarily to say that the packer or processor or live poultry dealer was always wrong in these instances, or necessarily to set up that sort of thing, but it just was that there was enough information that was coming out in hearings, there was enough that would come up in meetings around the country or whatever, to demonstrate that there were problems and that there ought to be clearer rules on when there might be a violation or might not, and to judge whether there was a violation and whether that sort of activity ought not to be allowed. So following this, and there's one other area, there was also just a provision to require better criteria to determine whether, if there's an arbitration provision requiring arbitration in one of the poultry growing contract, swine production contract, I think and it also would apply to marketing, like for beef, marketing contracts. I'm using terms here now, I realize maybe I ought to explain just a little bit what I'm talking about in terms of these types of contracts. A production contract typically involves the processing company or some other individual or firm that is somewhere along that chain of supply to the packer processor, that basically contracts with someone who owns the facilities on their farm, which would be a poultry growing house or a hog house or something like that. And they basically set the terms and set the compensation for growing out a set of chickens or pigs that's owned by this contracting company. And the contractor could be, again, could own the chickens, could own the pigs. Then they will set up a production contract that specifies the responsibilities on either side. Basically, how's the compensation supposed to be figured? What are the responsibilities of the grower of these pigs or chickens or whatever? Usually pigs or chickens, and that's basically what's covered by the Act here. Marketing contracts or marketing arrangements covered by the Packers and Stockyards Act. A marketing contract is to set basically what are the terms or how will the price be set for livestock, and very little poultry is done this way anymore, but it's mainly pigs or cattle, maybe sheep, that are still owned by the farmer, but are then, they may enter into a marketing contract, a marketing arrangement with the packer processor that basically sets the terms. If the grower continues to supply that livestock through this contract to the packer, then this marketing contract will specify what are the terms, what's the compensation, and so forth. So both of those are substantially different types of arrangements, but both of them are covered under the Packers and Stockyards Act, and both of them have their potential for unfair treatment or for discriminatory treatment and so forth. So the last one was then on arbitration. If there is an arbitration clause in the contract, then the Secretary was to issue criteria to specify and make sure that there's a meaningful opportunity for the grower or producer to participate fully in the arbitration process. That is not to have arbitration imposed as a take it or leave it proposition at the very end and say that we're imposing arbitration That's the only way you can proceed to resolve this. Or more often, to have an arbitration clause in a contract at the beginning that says all disputes are subject to arbitration, you basically have no other way, no other avenue through courts or whatever to resolve the dispute. So the department issued these proposed regulations to carry this out in it's June of 2010. There are many comments, about 61,000 comments that came in. Their department covered these 5 grounds, actually, that I mentioned, and then also got into some additional areas to interpret the Packers and Stockyards Act and to make sure that it was carried out more effectively and fairly. One of the key things that it did was to issue a definition and a clarification that the prohibition against unfair or unjustly discriminatory, deceptive practices, or against undue preferences, advantages, and so forth, that proving a violation on those bases did not require making essentially an antitrust claim. So that there had been about, I think, 3 federal circuit courts that had held, and maybe there was a 4th one pending, but a number of circuit courts had held, yes, you could, this grower could come in and make the claim out that there had been these violations that would otherwise, or these actions that would otherwise violate the Packers and Stockyards Act, but because there wasn't a harm to competition, meaning there wasn't really a harm in this action to other packers, processors, and so forth in terms of impairing the market, or there wasn't a harm to impairing the market as to other growers, then there couldn't be a recovery because they were essentially saying Packers and Stockyards Act is basically an antitrust competition law. But in fact, again, the GIPSA, in its proposed rule, it took the position, clarified the position it had for many years. Packers and Stockyards Act is remedial. It deals with interactions and transactions between the packers and individual parties or groups of producers. It doesn't require the showing of anti-competitive action or harm to competition or likely harm to competition. So that was one part of the proposed rule. The rule also then went further than was directly required by the Farm Bill to spell out what is unfair, unjustly discriminatory, or deceptive practices, and getting farther into this sort of situation where some producers might be treated better than others in terms of the prices paid to them or how they might be treated under the contracts. They also then further spelled out what could be unreasonable preferences or advantages or disadvantages or prejudices and so forth, spelled that out further. They also then did go into a rulemaking on the tournament system for poultry. It spelled out further the capital requirements, and so forth. The Farm Bill had specifically said address if there's some new capital investment requirement imposed partway through a contract. In the proposed rule, they got a little bit further into saying even up front, if there's a capital investment required as part of this contract, there ought to be essentially an opportunity to recover the cost over the course of that contract. And then there was also some further specifications on how dealers should operate out in the market. If a dealer is represented to be buying just for one packer, then that dealer ought not to be secretly buying for a number of packers in some way in that fashion, in a way that conceals prices paid or also gives a misimpression about who this dealer is representing. There also was a requirement that there couldn't be an exclusive arrangement, that in other words, one dealer is buying for only one packer unless that's disclosed, unless that's known to the people that are selling. And then there was a limitation on sales from one packer or enterprise controlled by one packer and sales over to another packer, because there had been findings that those sorts of sales, when the prices from those transactions were reported, those sorts of sales then skewed what the market information that was out there that then impacted the prices paid under other arrangements. So there is basically in the livestock market in particular, now there's essentially a method of pricing. I mean, this has occurred for many years, market prices, but now more and more of the livestock is essentially locked up under marketing contracts. And the prices under those marketing contracts are tied oftentimes into publicly reported prices. So if you have packers selling to packers, and if the prices paid are not a true reflection of the market, then when those prices get reported back into the market information system, those lower prices, which you would predict, can skew downward the prices that are reported, and then those lower prices are then incorporated into the marketing contracts as to the price paid to people when they're delivering their livestock to the packer. So in terms of what has happened since, about the past week, there has been some very significant action on this. Basically, what has happened is the department had sent over some what they proposed to go final with over to the Office of Management and Budget. They had essentially limited what they were proposing to go final to just the four main items that were mentioned in items mentioned in the Farm Bill. They had dropped out at that point any rulemaking on the further defining criteria for undue or unreasonable preference or advantage. So that was a significant area where they had planned to go to a final rule just on the Farm Bill areas and not to get into some of the other clarifications of the Packers and Stockyards Act, clarifications that we felt were long overdue, as did the administration. They were then going to, I believe, do an interim final rule, or headed towards that, on the poultry and the tournament growing, I believe. But then in the meantime, the Appropriations Conference Committee produced its product, and it basically, again, blocked the department from going ahead with anything except just four elements that are in that were spelled out in the Farm Bill. And so let me just go back and again, those were the arbitration, those were reasonable notice of suspension of delivery of birds, additional capital investments, whether those could be required, what the criteria are, whether that's an unfair practice to impose additional capital requirements, and then also whether there is an opportunity to remedy a breach of contract. So what the Appropriations Committee blocked them going ahead on was dealing with the tournament system. The Appropriations Committee said can't do that. And how they do this is they say that no money in this bill can be used to pay salaries and expenses to carry out, and then they list what they can't carry out. So they couldn't deal with the poultry tournament system, couldn't deal with this question I talked about earlier, whether the Packers and Stockyards Act prevents mistreatment of individual producers or growers, or whether there has to be a showing of larger competitive injury or likely competitive injury. So that was blocked. Also then was blocked the proposed rule dealing with unfair, unjustly discriminatory and deceptive practices, blocked that whole part of the proposed rule. Blocked then the undue or unreasonable preferences and advantages, blocked that part. Blocked the livestock and poultry contracts. That was something I did not mention earlier, requiring essentially sample contracts to be posted so people could have a better idea whether they are getting a fair deal or not in what they're offered at their own farms. And it did leave in place the rest of them, as I mentioned, the Farm Bill related provisions. So that is a very substantial setback. We do think that there can be some good that will come out of the department being allowed to go ahead on these ones that were specifically spelled out in the Farm Bill. But what was blocked, basically, was the well-established authority of this agency, GIPSA, to clarify the statute that it's entrusted to enforce. And that's a well-established authority and power, and that power to clarify the regulation, or clarify the statute through regulations, is blocked for the time being. Now, it is a one-year bill that was passed, so I mean there is some thought whether potentially if the political situation, if the congressional situation were to change, then perhaps some of this rulemaking could be revived, at least if the block by Congress is removed, but I don't know yet what the next steps may be. So again, thank you very much for.
Thank you, Mr. Halverson. Given what's going on with the next Farm Bill over the last couple days and the next couple days, I really appreciate your taking the time to share that with us. If you weren't convinced prior to that presentation that there are lawmakers and concerned parties paying close attention to the details of fair treatment in the livestock and poultry markets, rest assured. And Once that concern becomes codified, then again I ask, what happens? How can we track it, measure it, and keep stock of it? So for that, please help me welcome Mr. Patrick Woodall.
Thanks for having me here, Ivy. And I'm Patrick Woodall. I'm with Food and Water Watch. We're a national consumer group, which seems a little counterintuitive to work on something as arcane as livestock antitrust regulations. But we've been working on it a long time because of champions like Senator Harkin, because it's incredibly important. There are 1 million livestock producers in America. There are 300 million eaters, and between us, there are about 10 companies. These companies have total control over the producers and over the choices and prices that we pay. Let's start with cattle, because this is the one that's most like an open market. So about 25% of cattle today are sold in an auction where willing buyers and willing sellers get together and come up with a price. This is actually the kind of form of the marketplace that the free market people think is the best way it should work. About 2/3 of them are under the marketing contracts that Mark alluded to. They are a farmer that agrees to deliver cattle to a meat packer. And about 10% are owned by the meat packing company themselves. Now, what does this mean? Now, 4 out of 5 cattle are slaughtered by the biggest 4 firms. This is a CR4 classic kind of antitrust perspective. Now, if you own 10% of the cattle and the price of cattle on the marketplace is high, you slaughter your own cows. If it's cheap, you buy cows on the open marketplace. And both of these factors mean that you can exert pressure through your marketing contracts on the farmers themselves. This, in the livestock market, this is as good as it gets, right? And one of the things that Ivy said was, where were they before? Where was the Packers and Stockyards Act before? Well, it was working actually pretty good for a long time. At cattle, it was 70% controlled by the big 4. Now it's 80%. It's been that way for quite a while. But in hogs, actually, even recently, most of the marketplace, it was much more diverse marketplace. But here's the key difference. Now, 2 out of 3 hogs, big 4 companies. What does this mean? Well, in hogs, about 45% are marketing contracts. That is, a farmer raises their own hogs, delivers them to the slaughterhouse. 45% are production contracts. That means the slaughterhouse owns the pigs. They come to you with a contract. You pretty much do what they say to deliver the hogs. And about 10% are on the open market. Now, as Mark said, that 10%, that tiny sliver, that thin, tiny marketplace where there are only a tiny number of buyers and a tiny number of sellers, that sets the target price for every other contract going. So what that ends up doing, now imagine the world that you live in when 2 out of 3 pigs, 4 out of 5 cattle are on the are bid on the auction. Well, there's no incentive for these companies to bid against one another. They have an incentive actually to drag the price down. And so what this does is have a suppressive value on the price that farmers are paid. And I'll show you a horrifying, dramatic evidence of this in a couple of slides. But, 45% of the hogs are on production contracts. What we call that in chicken basically is serfdom, right? You don't own the chickens ever. They show up with a box load of chicks. They show up with a bunch of feed. You work for them. Now, with a hog, it'll take you 4 months almost to get a hog to full growth before it goes to slaughter. But a broiler, 5 weeks. So if you don't do what they say, they don't show up in 5 weeks with the next load of birds. You don't own the birds. They're not your birds. They're Tyson's birds. They're Pilgrim's Pride's birds. So you're on the hook. Now this doesn't look as bad, right? Oh, only half, 1 out of 2 birds is owned by the big 4. But here's the hitch. Most broiler companies only draw from about 50 miles. And within 50 miles, most growers, half of all growers have only 1 or 2 options. A quarter of growers only have 1 option. So they have 100% market concentration. That is, the only company going that will take my birds, one company. You can't switch because then you'd be being unloyal to this company and then you get blackballed in the industry. And as Barry says, they will do this. Now, one of the rules that was initially in the rule that Senator Harkin championed was a prohibition against retaliating against growers for speaking out. Well, that seems pretty logical to me. If that seems like supportive of the free market, supportive of free speech. If I think my contract's unfair and I speak out against it, well, then the company could just cut me off. They can retaliate against me. Well, that sensible prohibition was axed by the Republicans in the appropriations process. That no longer will be part of the rule. So it's now open season on growers. Growers who spoke up over the past couple of years, including the growers that Barry talked to, open season on them by the poultry companies. What ends up happening with this situation, right? So all of these production contracts and the marketing contracts, that sounds all contractual. Who knows what that all means? But what it really means is that these companies control a supply of pigs or cattle or birds, and it means it's almost impossible for new market entrants to get into the system. It means what they're doing is they're pushing down the number of plants. They buy up competitors. There have been some major mergers over the past even several years. A Brazilian company, the largest meat company in the world, JBS, bought Swift Meats in 2007. A merger between Smithfield and Premium Standard Farms merged two of the biggest hog producers. And Pilgrim's Pride bought Gold Kiss. Pilgrim's now owned by JBS. So what you have is a constant pressure downwards. Now, we lost this is just the past decade. If you were to throw it out a lot further, it would be a much bigger loss. But over the past decade, we've lost 15% of the plants. Now, these are the small businesses we're talking about, right? These are the small businesses that can't compete because they can't get into the marketplace, they can't get an access to cattle, and they can't sell to the retailer. They're pretty much stuck, and the reason is because these monopolies control the marketplace. It's impossible for them to grow. Now, what this really means, of course, this is the number of plants. These are all in rural America, and what this means for workers is another significant thing. Now, we've lost 16,000 workers over the last decade in slaughterhouses, meat processing plants, and poultry plants. Now, they have lost wages. Meat processing workers lost, in real terms, they lost $1 an hour over the past decade. So even though the number of workers is lower, they have more productivity, they're getting paid less. In real terms, if you look at their total take, what we're talking about is a world in 2010 with more than $1 billion less in active wages that are going into these communities. So we have a concentrated marketplace, driving small businesses out, firing people, paying them less money, cracking unions, and ultimately what we have is less money going back into rural economies, less vibrant situation in the rural economies. But what about us? What about us eaters? I mean, they're giving all these efficiencies of scale, and they've got this great deal. They have this new supply chain that's managing cattle and hogs. It's all a good deal for us. But look, over the past decade, the consumer price index for meat has gone up by 40%. Now, I ask you to look at this curve very carefully, because in 2008, the price of corn, that's, 50% of the cost of animals is corn. It spiked tremendously, but yet the trend is still pretty steady. In fact, they're just raising prices all the time. It's just a steady raise, and it doesn't have anything to do with the cost of inputs because they control the marketplace. They can charge us what they want. They own all the cattle, all the hogs, all the pigs. So where's it going? So in 2006, only 19% of the money went back to the farm. This is according to USDA. USDA has recalculated this number, and actually now, using a new method, they come up with 13%. So it's an even smaller amount that goes back to the farm. But when you see it in terms of cattle and hogs, it's really pretty astounding. So back in 1970, almost three-quarters of the money that a cattle producer was going back to the farmer, and almost half the money for hogs. It has come down tremendously over the past 3 decades. So now cattle producers are getting like 42 cents on the dollar. That is, your sale, when you buy a steak, when you buy ground beef, 42 cents of it's gone back to them. The rest of it is marketing, it's the retailer, and of course, it's the packer. The same is true with the hog side, right? So half the money, so 50 cents on the pork chop dollar, goes back to the farmer in 1970. Today, it's less than a quarter. So what does this mean? Why is that? Well, the real farm gate and cattle prices have been coming down. This is only 20 years, but the real decline is incredibly significant. So what we have seen is that over the past couple of decades, the real price of beef has come down. This is what farmers are paid. The real price of beef has fallen by more than a third at the very lowest point, which is in 2002, but is down by a third, down by 27% even today. And that means farmers are getting less in real terms. And who's making the savings? Well, it's the packers. They're not bidding as much against one another. They can push the prices down. They have all of these fantastic marketing agreements that are giving them efficiencies of scale, but the efficiencies are all captured by the packer, as I showed with the consumer slides. For hogs, it's much, much worse. So the real price of hogs fell by 50% during the 90s. This is not 100 years ago. This is not some revolution where you're talking about something that happened a long time ago. These are real prices that went down by 50% between 1990 and 2000. And what that ended up doing was pushing a lot of guys straight out of business. But we don't actually get much of a pickup. So here's what this looks like with something that people actually eat. Because, we push down on farmers, but most of us don't know farmers. We're here in Washington. But when you see what happens, here is hogs versus bacon. So the real price of hogs comes down, but the real price of bacon goes up. So what happens? The packer is paying less to the farmer, and they're charging us more. That difference, that margin, is what the packers are taking, and they can take it from us because they have all the control in the marketplace. It's not any different for ground beef and beef cattle. So you see the beef cattle prices just over the last 15 years have been a little flat, come up a little bit. The price of ground beef has gone up. This is the cheapest cut of meat too, right? This is the very cheapest cut of meat. So where are our savings? Where are the farmers' earnings? Well, it's all being captured by the guys in the middle, right? That's the way this works. It's like a giant hourglass. There are a bunch of farmers at the top producing the food we eat every day. In the middle, there are the processing companies, the slaughterhouses, the packers, and at the bottom, we get the dregs. We pay more, farmers get less, the guys in the middle capture all of it. This is why this rule is so important. This is why we fought tooth and nail in the 2002 Farm Bill to get stuff like country of origin labeling. Took 2 Farm Bill cycles to get country of origin labeling, and why we fought in 2008 to get the GIPSA rules in place, to get these issues in place. So how does this work? Over the last 30 years, we have lost 90% of the hog operations. 90%. We've lost about 30% of the beef cattle operations. But even over the past decade, these numbers continue to fall. So in the past 10 years, we've lost 18,000 hog producers, 21%. And from a low number, right? We used to have almost over 650,000 hog producers 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Now we're down to 69,000 hog producers, and the number of cattle producers fell by 13%. So we're talking about a significant loss. Now, why does this matter, right? So if we're going to care about, there's the consumer side, which is obviously an issue of price and an issue of choice, right? So they own the whole meat case. They sell by a bunch of different brand names. So if you go in to buy pork from Smithfield, it's marketed under 12 different names. It's marketed under Gwaltney, it's marketed under Armour, under John Morrill, it's marketed under Farmland, it's marketed under Ectric. These all look like different things. It seems like we have a panoply of choices. It's like a utopia of choices in the supermarket, but really the sellers are all the same. On the farm side, what we're talking about is fewer farms, fewer meat packing plants, fewer jobs, lower wages, and in real terms, what we're talking about is for the little guys, and I mean the overwhelming majority of producers that are not throwing off a ton of money. That money stayed in rural communities, right? Because they bought their feed locally. They went to local service operations. There was a multiplier effect where they would actually drive local rural economies. And of course, the big guys, they suck the cream out of the marketplace and they suck at home. So it's going back to Brazil, or it's going to headquarters. It's going to the Wall Street investors. It's not going into rural America. And what ends up happening, we looked just at a decade's worth of data, and what we found is that we lost about a third of the real revenue. So that what these guys are taking in for the smaller size cattle operations with under $100,000 in sales, which is most cattle operations. These are cow-calf operators that are selling further into the marketplace, and hog farms with lower than $250,000 in sales, which is about 60% of hog farms. Those guys, the numbers came down and their earnings came down because the price that they're receiving comes down. And what that means is, in the past decade, we've lost $7 billion in the rural economy because of this incredibly concentrated marketplace. So there are real costs to this. But it's not just there. So this is what it looks like in the rest of the supermarket, right? So this is just the snack aisle. You go in, you see an infinite number of varieties of nacho cheese flavoring sold to you by the same couple of companies. This is just cookies and crackers. So 3 out of 4 crackers, just 3 companies. 3 out of 5 cookies, 4 companies. All these different brands. So this shows you the market share and the brands. So it's crazy not just in the meat case, but it's crazy in the supermarket. And it's crazy in frozen dinners. This is the same sort of thing. You have for regular single-serve frozen meals, more than 80% by just 4 firms. And for multi-serve frozen meals, 2/3. So what does this mean? Why are we here? Why are we doing this? So the reason that we got engaged is to actually build some power. Right now, if what we're talking about is a situation where people are yearning for a fair food system. On the farm side, they want to be more connected with the food that they eat. On the consumer side, they want to make more adequate choices. You cannot make adequate choices when the marketplace is completely locked up by the big boys. And so this is why we got engaged in this fight. We worked with Senator Harkin while this was happening during 2008. Farm Bill is signed in June of 2008. 2 years later, in June of 2010, 2 years later, they issue a proposed rule. 18 months after that, they issue a final rule, and each step of the way, the Packers have been attacking it mercilessly. They say it's going to kill jobs. They've been killing jobs already. They say that it's going to raise prices. They're already raising prices. I mean, the last decade of experience has really been showing us what Packers can do. They can actually really destroy the marketplace. But what ended up happening during this entire process was a demand by the meat packers to examine the cost and the economic benefits of the rule. And that's what USDA examined, but they largely examined the cost to the industry itself. So they examined the cost of the efficiency costs to the meat packers and the buyers. I contend that this doesn't look at any of the costs to the rural economy, which are quite significant, and the costs that consumers pay in terms of higher prices and reduced choices. So this is important on the meat packer side. I work with a lot of cow-calf operators, independent hog producers, and a bunch of poultry growers who are totally on the hook to these integrators. And it's important to them. It is their livelihood. They speak up and someone retaliates against them, they lose their farm, their kids don't go to college. It is a serious, serious deal. And these are guys that are just squeaking by. Most of these guys are not netting out a ton of money. And the reason is because the companies are really putting the bite on them. But it's true across the supermarket. The meat case is the area where there's been the most energy. But I think the reality is that throughout the supermarket, a tiny number of firms are controlling what's going on. They're controlling the choices that we get as consumers. They are really pushing down on farmer prices. And this is the kind of stuff that we are working to change. We tried in the last Farm Bill. We're going to try in the next Farm Bill and the Farm Bill after that. And we're going to keep working on it. We're going to work on it with farmers, with consumers, and advocacy groups across the country because this is really important. This question, this control prevents other choices. It means you cannot do other stuff because in the end, these guys control the marketplace. They control the shelf space in the supermarket. They control the choices that you have. So we're happy and working with lots of people that work on things like farmer market issues, which are very, very important to change the marketplace in terms of showing demand for alternative stuff. But really, we're not going to be able to shop our way out of the marketplace until we get these guys out of the way, until we have a fair marketplace where small businesses have a decent shake against the big guys, where independent farmers can make a fair living by raising their livestock and delivering it to market, and where consumers have adequate choices. And that's why we've been fighting for the GIPSA rule. It's why we're going to fight for the Fair Farm Bill rules for the next Farm Bill and beyond. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Woodall. Those of you who do not live here in our nation's capital might want to plan to make some calls to your senators this evening if you're fired up by this. You know, I grew up in North Dakota. I'm the daughter and granddaughter of farmers. And when I think about all of our family and friends who lost farms and the $7 billion that are taken out of our rural communities. I'm angry. But I'm also anxious to hear your thoughts on this. What questions or comments do you have for our panel today?
I think for us, the simplest way to approach this is whether farmers face constrained choices because of the pressure from the buyers. So if you envision a world where farmers are pushed because the price they receive comes down, they are precluded from making a lot of choices. And this is what has driven many farmers to get big or get out. So they either can deliver 10,000 head of pigs a year or they can't. And when they make those choices, they obviously are making choices about production. One of the things that we think is pretty clear is that the scale of operations has gotten bigger, not because of efficiency per se, but because of demand and pressure of efficiency along the meat packer chain. There are efficiencies for a larger scale to some extent, but even USDA figures suggest that there are diminishing returns to scale after a certain size. So that's one element. The other issue that we're very concerned about is this issue of kind of resiliency in terms of the food supply. So we saw a couple of summers ago 500 million eggs pulled off the marketplace, right? Because there was a massive salmonella recall of eggs. So you have two operations, two farms out of, the concentration in eggs is CR4 is like a third. So the biggest four control about a third of the marketplace, way lower than some of these other things. And you have 1 billion eggs recalled because of a food safety issue that can occur primarily because of concentration. So then if there's a problem at one plant, it's in everybody's kitchen at that point. So I think those elements are the key question. I mean, people talk a lot about the kind of niche market of grass-fed beef or organic dairy production, and these are all fantastic things. The question is whether they have the opportunity to enter the marketplace with this kind of concentrated market power. Ultimately, what happens is they can get up to a certain size, but there's kind of a glass ceiling, and what ends up happening is some of the big companies buy them out. Cargill Beef bought up most of the natural beef options on the front range of the Rockies in the past couple of years. So.
Actually, I'd like to actually add a couple of examples to that. I mean, this is something we saw, this sort of issue of the concentration and food security. There was a case, as probably a number of you will remember, about 4 years ago with our pet food supply. And what happened is that suddenly we found that a bunch of our dogs and cats were having all these kidney problems and dying. And eventually they traced it back to this one plant in Kansas. Called Menu Foods, run by a company called Menu Foods. And, this is one of those cases in which you've got many, many, many brands in all these different stores, but they're all actually they're all not, coming from one company, and actually in this case rolling off the same line. So you actually saw some of the most expensive brands of dog and cat food and some of the cheapest cans of dog and cat food all coming off the same line. There were actually well more than 150 different brands coming off of this one company line. And then, so when as Patrick was saying, when something went wrong in this one place, it went wrong every place simultaneously. So suddenly there were all large parts of the United States in which there was really no dog or cat food around that you could trust. I mean, it's not necessarily a tragedy at that point because there's other ways to feed your dogs and cats. But one of the lessons of this was that this is a case in which this one company, it was actually serving, you see all these, even including branded companies, like Procter & Gamble and stuff, they were all buying from this one company, private label. What happens is that when you have this kind of pressure in which this company, Menu Foods, year after year after year after year has been barely scraping by, sometimes close to bankruptcy, sometimes like running a little bit in the black, but they fundamentally do not capture a sufficient capital to even maintain their own systems, to run the system safely, because there's other players in the system who are capturing the profit, and it's not Menu Foods. But then there's this other aspect of monopoly control and food safety, and I'll just give a couple of quick examples, which is vitamin C. It's called, which is also known as ascorbic acid. Vitamin C, ascorbic acid goes into pretty much every packaged food that we have on our shelves because it's a great preservative. And vitamin C is a sort of it's a molecule that was sort of first identified by an American scientist. It was first synthesized by an American scientist. It was first mass-produced by an American company. It was first blended into food systems on a large scale to improve health, in this case to fight scurvy, in the United States at the behest of the U.S. government. Right now, because of this fight that took place over the last 20 years between the European vitamin cartel and the U.S. Manufacturers, and then once they'd wiped out the American manufacturers, between the Chinese vitamin cartel and the European vitamin cartel, which a fight that was won by the Chinese, 100% of our vitamin C now comes from China. 100% of the ascorbic acid now comes from China. And one, we have no real control over the quality of that product day after day. And two, pricing. Just to give you one, for instance, the day the Chinese vitamin C cartel finished capturing control over that product, jacked the prices 400%. And the issue also is security of supply. I mean, if there's any kind of dispute between the United States and China, it's not just vitamin C, it's not just ascorbic acid. 80-90% of the chemicals that go in our drug system offshore in China. So it's like any kind of dispute. I don't know if you guys paid attention last year to the issue of when China shut off the supply of rare earth metals to Japan to chase Japan away from some islands in the South China Sea. If China chooses, if we have any kind of a spat with the Chinese, Lord knows what they could cut off. Yeah, I haven't, other than the issues of chemicals. I mean, most of the United States, in terms of production of calories, we're still an exporter of calories. I mean, there's no. So it's really issues of certain types of items that come into the United States where there hasn't been a lot of attention paid, and I have not mapped it beyond these couple of instances. But what I can tell you is that within the industrial system as a whole, and this is actually how I got into this line of work, is looking at the fragility within the industrial system. This is true of pretty much every industrial system on which we depend. Which industrial system used to be doubly compartmentalized, vertically integrated firms within vertically integrated nation states. 15 years ago, that's the way it was. Over the last 15 years, we've seen a double revolution: the elimination of the vertically integrated corporation, and sort of the merger of the supply base, the communalization of the supply base. And we've seen that that globalization also means the communalization of supply among nations. So you end up now with numerous single points of failure within this system. It could be vitamin C in one case, all 100%, but it's also true for certain kinds of semiconductors, certain kinds of information processes. So the number of potential pathways of catastrophe into the systems on which we rely it's almost innumerable.
I can answer on food on a number of things. So 80% of our apple juice is imported, almost all of it from China. Tons of our produce is imported, obviously, and part of this is globalization, but the other part of it is pressure downwards on the buyers, on American farmers. There is a tool on our website called Global Grocer, where we go through 50 different pieces of produce and explain both canned and fresh, and explain where it's from, the chances of what you're going to buy at the supermarket, whether it's imported or not, and where it's from. So that is out there. But this is true of tons and tons of stuff. Some colossal volume, almost 60% of the catfish we eat here is imported, even though we have tons of producers in the Southeast. It is true across the board. Now, the question as to what we can do about it beyond our control, theoretically, we could inspect the food that we import. That would be kind of the starting place where we would say. And what FDA says is, they don't inspect things that they think are pretty safe. And that's what happened with the pet food ingredient. They said, well, it seems like wheat gluten or rice gluten is pretty safe, so we won't look at it. So the FDA's inspection determination system of what's safe is you're the guinea pig. So the next shipment of tainted milk powder with chemicals that comes from China that gets into thousands of products in America, well, we'll find out when someone gets sick. And that's the kind of observation. Theoretically, we could sample enough. Let's put this in perspective. USDA, we only import meat from about 40 countries, and USDA has to go there and look at their plants and look at the way they run their meat inspection and make a determination as to whether it's similar to ours. So we import from 40 countries, and we inspect, even with that, we inspect 10% of the pieces that come across the border. In comparison, we are open to all comers on fish from 150 countries, and USDA looks at 1 in 50 shipments. So, you can use your own judgment. It's way lower, down to 0 on some things, as we've sadly seen so in the past couple of years.
FDA rather than US.
Yeah, FDA has a much lower total, and on average, FDA inspects 1%, but even that's a selection of things. For things like seafood, it's higher, it's 2%, but it's 0 for things like wheat gluten.
Mr. Woodall and Food and Water Watch have been doing a lot of work on country of origin labeling, which is where some of this comes from. Mr. Halverson?
I was just going to say on inspection of imports, I think the figure is maybe 1 or 2% of the imports that FDA has jurisdiction over are actually inspected. And so that's been the figure for quite a number of years. So when Senator Harkin had the opportunity to become chair of the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, he then worked to get past the Food Safety Modernization Act. It does take a lot of steps. It will not change things overnight with respect to imports, but at least it does provide for spending some additional funding and also to try to better coordinate the systems of food safety and inspection between the United States and some countries that we get products from. Some of it's a little easier or at least less difficult to address. Let's say it's fruits or vegetables that are imported. If there could be some coordination and certainly stronger measures to protect against microbial contamination of fruits and vegetables in the U.S., but also then if suppliers from South America or whatever, if they will meet these tougher standards, if their food safety authorities will help meet the tougher standards. That is at least one example. A lot more troubling, though, is the supply chain where there could be any number of food ingredients that get imported and incorporated into other products, and tracing that is very difficult part of a global supply chain. And keeping tabs on the safety of that. Again, the Act does encompass that and seeks to address it. On this Food Safety Modernization Act, at least in that area, the appropriators did actually do something good, and there is about $40 million additional for fiscal 2012 to get started carrying that out. I'm not suggesting that the Food Safety Act is a solution or a panacea for all of these problems, but at least it does start to try and does have some mechanisms to address the risks involved in imports and a more global food system.
When I started my last book, one of the people, about halfway through, I started to call up Michael Pollan, and I said, Michael, you really got to, I want your endorsement on this book. And he, at first was very reticent to do so, because what he wanted to do is hold up a vision, which is actually super important. Like, hold up a vision of here's how you can grow things up. And my whole thing is like, well, at the same time as you're growing things up, like in the case of beer, you have this incredible ferment in terms of what's going on in that industry. Yet when people get up to a certain size, there's just no place to go. So you have to come along also with the big broad axe and chop some things down to create space for the little things to grow up. Initially. Michael wanted to focus really just on the growing side of the equation, Since, he's really sort of spent some time with the book, he's actually become very, he's seen exactly this. And there's a number of other people, Eric Schlosser, who I've been working with. Robbie Kenner actually made the movie Food Inc. He was actually considered doing, we were in discussions about whether he'd do a movie of Cornered, a film based on Cornered. And so suddenly there's now this absolutely, the idea of bringing together these areas where you've seen what is really a grassroots revolution going on, and sort of letting people understand that what they're doing, that there are limits to what they're doing in the present political economic regime, that they're going to bump up against. And a lot of the people who are in these businesses know that they can feel the limits already. But also seeing that what these limits that they're bumping into, these are systemic. They are every place. So, you said, it's like, can you connect Tea Party to Occupy to food movement? I also look at it as connecting Tea Party to Occupy to food movement to the people who care about books, who write books, who look at this massive concentration of power, which is absolutely unacceptable to have a single private company with the ability to pick and choose winners and losers in the book industry. Unacceptable. You connect that also to what's going on in sector after sector after sector, be it advertising or Silicon Valley. And then when you have these different groups together, when people understand that the local Goliath that they're fighting, that the local Goliath against, that is beating them, that if they all join forces, they can beat these Goliaths together, I think we have some.
Well, I think obviously they've got to do better enforcement. Right in 2010.
That's my question.
No.
How do they do better?
I am vexed by this problem as it is extremely difficult. In 2010, USDA and the Department of Justice launched a historic series of workshops on agricultural concentration. President Obama, when campaigning, had concentration issues in his platform. And what has come of those has been extraordinarily disappointing. I think the kind of collapse and implosion of the GIPSA rule is endemic of this issue. I completely agree that Christine Varney's tenure was, although extremely promising, really generated very little. So the question is on a number of the big question, I suppose, is on this merger question. And because of the economy and because of the kind of economic position of these companies, we haven't seen a lot of very large mergers come up. One would hope that they would take a closer look. It doesn't appear they're taking a very close look in other sectors, so I'm not especially engaged in believing they'll do this. I think this needs statutory approach. I believe that we actually need to deal with this in law, and one of the places to do it is in the Farm Bill. In 2002, Senator Johnson and Senator Harkin proposed a competition title. I believe that's necessary in the Farm Bill. I believe the livestock title that generated very popular things like GIPSA, but even more popular things like country of origin labeling, was a first step, and I think it needs to expand beyond. As much as I love talking about the arcana of Packers and Stockyards Act, and I do, it needs to expand beyond the PNSA.
In terms of like what one might do politically, we have to, one way to understand what has happened, how this sort of sudden, we were going along and we thought we lived in an open market system, and we thought we lived in an open political system, and boom, all of a sudden it's like everything is rather closed, and it's closing down a lot faster than we could ever have imagined. What happened is, if we go back to, this was not the way it was 35 years ago. So we can go back and we can see what changed, and that actually gives us the power to change it back. One of the things that changed was 1981 when Ronald Reagan came to power. One of the first things he did, or one of the first things his new antitrust person, William Baxter, did in 1981 is said, you know what? Up until now, we've been doing, the purpose of antitrust has been to protect us as citizens. Well, we're going to actually, we don't believe that's an efficient way to run our legal system. What we want to do is we want to enforce antitrust going forward to promote efficiency. Efficiency. It was later, it was about 2 years later that they actually came up with the frame that we now use to explain the new frame that we placed around our existing body of antitrust, anti-monopoly laws. Because the new frame is called consumer welfare. That was the one that was put into place in the early 1980s under Reagan. So, I mean, it's like you have bodies of law, and then you have the frames that you use to interpret how to enforce these bodies of law. So we went from a frame that said we're going to interpret our anti-monopoly laws as being existing to protect us against concentration of power, and this goes back to 1773. No, we're going to throw that out. And it also protects the individual, by guaranteeing the individual a person bringing labor or goods to a marketplace of having an open market where they can interact openly with their neighbors, with the community. So they got rid of that. They replaced it with something that's like promoting consumer welfare, but it fundamentally is promoting efficiency. And if you go back in time, it's like, who were the people who promoted efficiency in economics? It was J.P. Morgan. It was John D. Rockefeller. And it's like he said, it's much more, I mean, you go back, they use the word efficiency. It's much more efficient if you leave in my hand the power to decree outcomes in the energy sector. That's better for society. Who else? The Stalinists and Walmart.
So, Jim, I would just say that it does seem that even if we were just talking about the Packers and Stockyards Act and not some of the broader antitrust issues and challenges, if even in what USDA can carry forward now, it's incremental, but probably all of this is going to be relatively incremental, and maybe there'll be some additional opportunities for people to stay in business and not be run out because they weren't given a chance to cure their alleged breach of contract, or to be run out because for retaliation or not having an advance notice, at least on when a contract is going to be terminated. Maybe some people will have a better ability to stay in business because they have a little fairer chance under arbitration or whatever, but maybe there'd be a little better opportunity for some additional people to stay in business. If the department had been able to go ahead with what it had proposed, I think then you could say there might be some additional opportunities, again, for people to stay in business, maybe for more people to come into the business of raising livestock, poultry, and so forth, and have a chance to survive. And then conceivably, if the playing field has to be leveler or fairer, I think it's not inconceivable that you might have somewhat marginally a greater ability for new entrants even into the processing. If there's less ability for the existing packers to run them out when they try to get in, I think that, again, it's incremental, but I think that has some potential. I don't know whether there would be any potential for, given the way the courts are now composed, I think it's very tough to come back in with new cases. I'm not an expert in antitrust, but one of the really unfortunate things that there are precedents on the books now that are so tough to come up against, and either it's going to require statutory change or some new theory that gets us back around to more considerations other than what I think, though, is, in a way, that's the consumer interest and the efficiency argument, but I even think that sometimes is misguided and mischaracterized. It certainly was in this argument over this GIPSA rule about what's the interest of jobs. We had arguments against the proposed rule on the basis of lost jobs, lost income opportunities, cost to consumers, and so forth. All those were basically mistaken, we thought, on the facts, but they were certainly alleged. So I suspect that likewise in many other contexts where the argument is this is necessary for consumers or efficiency or whatever, it's just mistaken.
Thank you for these excellent questions. I'm sorry we don't have time for more, but I do invite you all to grab a cup of coffee and some dried fruit and ask more questions of our panelists if they have a time to stay. Mr. Halverson, I can't let you leave without asking your hunch for whether a farm bill is going to sneak through on Wednesday.
I think not. I think
Something to hang on to. Please join me in thanking our panel today.